A very warm welcome to day 2 of the ALLEA Member Academy's General Assembly, and specifically to this scientific symposium, Transforming Science. Huge title, okay? And we are going to cover a lot of ground from now until 3 o'clock. We're going to explore very timely and compelling topics from the fields of science, society, and policy. Our event is hosted by the Royal Academy of Sciences, Letters and Arts of Belgium and the Royal Flemish Academy of Belgium for Science and the Arts. My name is Katrina Sickle, and I have, and I choose this word wisely, genuinely, the privilege of navigating us all through this second day until about 3:15. Now, today's event is going to wrestle with several key themes across 3 headline sessions, which focus in on diverse elements of our overarching topic, which is, of course, transforming science for the future. Why is this so critical? You all know, but let's revisit it. Current crises, future crises, very abrupt transitions are just going to continue to require scientific institutions really to transform research cultures, specifically to develop trust-building strategies, and, of course, to improve science advice mechanisms. And this transformation has to take into account, you know this better than I, and balance the urgency of addressing some very complex and interlinked global emergencies with, alongside, a rise in societal expectations and demands towards research and its role and responsibility in an era of increasing lack of trust. Given this context, our first thematic session is going to explore science-policy relations in times of complexity. Our second, just before lunch, will look at transforming research cultures themselves. And our third will zoom in on climate sustainability in academia. So please, here's my request. Well, those of you I don't think are going anywhere today, but those of you who are with us online, please, go somewhere from time to time, but do stay with us till the end of the journey, because it does all fit together really beautifully. Before we dive into our first session, let me remind you all, and some of our speakers were asking, well, who have we got, Kat? More difficult to say exactly who is with us online, but we do have an international crowd, you, our audience. We've got membership organisations, we've got science academies and associations, funding organisations, we've got science advisors, we've got research policy community, young scientists, EU and local policy makers, researchers, I think a bit of media, so the works. So really quite a diverse range. So let me just remind you very briefly of how you can be involved today, and that also goes for all of you who are online. Can you please post some words of wisdom, something inspiring on Twitter, if that's your thing, #TransformingScience. We also invite you, so those of you online, you can post questions from time to time in the chat on Zoom. Those are going to be curated and sent to me. I don't know if you've got a wide shot of me, but if you had, you would see an iPad on the desk, and I will pose those to our speakers later on in the sessions. Those of you here, it's the old-fashioned way. It's a raised hand into which a microphone will be put. Here's the deal, please. You've got to keep it short. Okay, I have grilled these brainy speakers to keep it short. You've got to do your thing. We won't take long questions. I mean half a sentence. Say who you are or your organisation. Say to whom it's addressed. Basta. The rest of the chat you can do in the networking, okay? That is the golden rule. I'm horribly bossy. Christiane knows this because she's already, we already were together at an event some years ago. Okay, enough from me. Let us get stuck into this very first 80-minute session. We're looking at science-policy relations in times of complexity. We're living in a very unpredictable world. We've got these interlinked challenges. They're becoming more and more complex. So we can collect data. Well, I say we can collect data and analyse it at an unprecedented pace. Yes, there's still a lot of gaps in data. How do we define better data? What are those gaps? And so on for the various sectors. But are we transforming that knowledge into the right kind of information that supports policy making and benefits society? That's hard. That's not a walk in the park. The pandemic and, of course, the climate challenge provide examples of the many tricky issues we encounter when you've got knowledge that is continuously evolving and complex problems, and you're trying to take that into account and inform policy decisions in those times of crisis. Finally, we have 4 speakers to stimulate your green cells. Green cells is quite good. Sustainability is going to come up today. Let's say green cells. Yeah, I like green cells. Okay, so let's see who they are. There they are. You have them here. So we have Christiane Woopen, who has been Heinrich Hertz Professor of Life Ethics at the University of Bonn and founding director of the Center for Life Ethics since 2021. We also have Michael Bang, and I'm keeping bios super short, and they know this, my lovely speakers. We've got Michael Bang Petersen. He's a professor of political science at Aarhus University in Denmark, and he leads a large-scale research project on how democracies cope with COVID-19. So looking at the non-medical aspects of the corona crisis in Denmark and beyond. Dr. Tina Comes, she is a full professor. I love this. I'd love Tina to have, brilliant, a full professor on decision theory and information technology for resilience at TU Delft, Netherlands, and full professor in decision making and digitalization at the University of Maastricht, but she also chairs the SAPEA working group on the future of the EU's strategic crisis management. I'm also looking at you at home. I mustn't forget that you are there. And Eric Lambin, he's a geographer and an environmental scientist, and he divides his time between the University of Louvain and Stanford, and his research tries to specifically better understand the causes and impacts of land use changes in different parts of the world. That is just but the tip of the iceberg of their brilliance. I want to stop there. I'm going to invite our first speaker. Three of them know each other, but we'll talk about this. I mean, they all know each other, but three of them kind of collaborate, but we'll talk about that in terms of an advisory capacity to the Commission. So I'm going to invite our first speaker to join me, Christiane Woopen. So you may ascend these delightful wooden stairs. There's your donger, as we call it. And so what I'm going to ask you, I'm going to give you the place there. You can give a warm round of applause. You've got to do this. It's quite... It's never great being the first person. What is the main thrust of your presentation this morning? What do you want to frame these conversations with?
I want to show how scientists should behave when giving policy advice.
Lovely. Okay, the floor is yours. See you in a bit.
Thank you very much, Katrina. Dear Antonio, dear Didier Vivier, thank you very much for having me here, dear guests. What I try to point out is that scientists are actually sitting between all stools when giving policy advice. And I do not distinguish, as the State Secretary did yesterday, between policy advice and politics in such a strong way he did yesterday. We should have discussed that, but there was, of course, no time. So, being caught between all stools, I would say yes. What kind of stools do I mean? First, there is the civil society. Science is embedded in civil society. It lives from civil society. It is responsible, accountable to civil society. But scientists sometimes think, well, oh, it's so difficult to tell them all these things. Yeah, they don't understand it. And when people talk about science communication, it's mainly about, from top down, explaining them the wonderful things scientists do. Therefore, you need media. That's another tool. Media are loving headlines that scientists do not love because they're either catastrophes or huge promises. Media have another language. They are short. They cannot explain so long and lengthy issues. So it's already difficult to talk with media. Media, of course, are very dependent on culture. And scientists are also dependent on culture. The questions scientists pose, the way results of sciences are interpreted, are dependent on the cultural background and how people think, where they come from, where the collective memory frames these results. So culture is another issue where sciences have to deal with. Then the economy. Sciences are dependent on economy, on finances, on working according to the incentives also in the economical area. Yeah. Sometimes scientists frame their questions and research projects according what economy or politics favor. Yeah. Should it be that way? We heard about that yesterday as well. And then there's politics. There's a whole set of different structures and governing issues that are very different between politics and sciences. Politics have to decide very quickly. They are not so much interested, at least not in the primary way, in truth, but in society has to work, I want to be re-elected, I want to have compromises, I will come to that later. And there are all the other sciences. So put a constitutional legal scholar together with an ethicist and a biologist and let them talk about self-determination and autonomy. And then saying an engineer who's talking about autonomous cars as if they could decide to become a nurse 2 days after having driven to Lisbon. So there's a whole lot of different framings, and yeah, you all have to take this into account if you do policy advice as a scientist. And my science notion, my concept of science is important to understand, not the difference between natural sciences and humanities. I think this is continuing the story of different ontologies in this world that do not exist as far as I perceive it. I think it would be good to have an encompassing sciences notion, including all sciences, and then distinguishing, of course, between disciplines, but not opposing natural sciences who are there to examine what the fact is, collecting great data and so on, and all those who are just sitting there talking, trying to make sense of something, but don't find the truth. Yeah, but being a little bit of, tomorrow this and the day after tomorrow something different. So I will want to present you 6 theses for food for thought for the discussion afterwards. My first thesis is that there's no such thing like a bilateral relationship between sciences and politics and policy advice. Yeah, we always have to take account of all the other stools around because politics has to do that as well. It is an illusion to say that science advice is value-free, for example. The questions that you pose and bring up, the answers that you give, the framings, the assessment, the evaluations, everything is value-laden. We'll come back to that later. Second thesis, scientific policy advice mostly deals with so-called wicked problems. Climate change, the pandemic, embedding artificial intelligence into societies and different societal areas is all about wicked problems. Wicked problems are defined, according to Brian Head, from 3 aspects. There are high level, not low level, but high level of complexities. Systems, subsystems, interactions, relationships that are very complex are at stake. There's no possibility, like Antonio pointed out yesterday as well, that only one disciplinary approach could tackle this question. Second high level is that about uncertainty. So wicked problems are defined so that already to frame the question is difficult. It is not one clear question. There are a whole lot of questions coming in. The evidence is incomplete. The evidence is shifting, has to adjust. The evidence is dependent on around which corner you are coming in. And if there's a third level of complexity, the value divergence, having different stakeholder and people who are interested in this problem and involved in this problem, and with wicked problems and our most urgent problems, it is the society as well, and not only sciences or politics, it's the whole area and the whole world, actually. Then you have different interests, different values, different preferences, different cultures coming in. And this value divergence needs discourse, needs to understand each other, needs to figure out which values are at stake at all. So having all these 3 high levels of complexity, uncertainty, and value divergence is characteristic for wicked problems. Third thesis, multidisciplinarity in science advice is key, is essential. That's a quote from a statement. So the European Group on Ethics in Science and New Technologies, where I was a chair, had together with a group of chief scientific advisors, where Eric Lambin now is a member, we decided to have joint opinions, 3 joint opinions. Usually the GCSA, so the group of chief scientific advisors, and the SSS, the European Group on Ethics, worked parallel. They had no relationship, but the former chair, president of the GCSA, and myself said, well, the pandemic is the moment where these groups should work together. It was not easy to bring them together in terms of administrational issues and so on, but we managed at least to have 2 joint opinions. We planned to have a third one, but then the term of the European Group on Ethics ended, and I wonder if the new established EGE will be included in that third opinion again. We will see. But this first opinion was a statement on scientific advice to European policymakers, also including Peter Peart, a special advisor to President von der Leyen. And I just quote, these discussions across disciplines have to be organized and coordinated well, given that the range of perspectives is wide and the scholars involved may not always be familiar with working across the territories of other disciplines. It takes time. But if it would be on an institutional level, if it would be guaranteed from the beginning that the GCSA and the EGE, that's just an example, work together on specific topics, or at least meet on a regular basis or so. They don't have to be merged, but they have to exchange their views. And when we filed up the questions for this, for SAPEA, for the third opinion, the evidence for crisis resilience, it was so obvious that these different perspectives had to come together, because not one discipline can cover all the other perspectives and questions that are in there. Thesis 4, every science and every policy has to consider ethically relevant values in one way or the other. That was our very last statement from the former EGE, a statement on values for the future, where we also said that values are just baked into everything. Just as I said at the beginning, there is nothing, according to my opinion, as a value-free science. Yeah, already the question you ask with regard to cell biology has a specific worldview or a concept of health or a concept of how you should deal with the body in mind. That is not a problem. It's actually an asset. But we have to be aware of this mechanism underlying that. Thesis 5. Sciences do not tolerate compromise. Political decision-making depends on compromise. And you have to take this into account when doing scientific policy advice. So you start from different positions, and there is pluralism, there is controversy, and it is in politics and in sciences. And that's fine, as long as it is the starting point for discourse and for finding out what the specific detail of controversy is. Because mostly we stay at a very superficial or quite a superficial level of discourse, just bringing positions against each other and saying there is a discourse if you describe these positions adequately. But that's not the point, that's only the starting point. Then you have to find out, where is the actual difference? Where is the actual controversy? Is it in some assumptions? Is it in the method? Is it in the social imaginaries about the world, the desirable futures for societies, and what is now the difference? So pluralism is okay as long as you stay in discourse. Then there's the other one, consensus, where we are all striving for because it feels better to have a consensus. And a scientific consensus is good. If virologists, as in the pandemic, have different views on how this virus evolves and what the future of this virus and the pandemic will be, that's of course a problem. And consensus is mainly the thing that you come together and that you agree on a lot of issues that are important, or most issues that are important. But that's how scientists try to work, to reach a consensus afterwards, but it's not the way politics works. Politics is about compromise. And compromise means also starting from different points, but then find a kind of overlap, but really get rid of important things that you actually appreciate very much. And I think it's important to see that scientists shouldn't buy into contributing to this compromise. There is a border between sciences and politics, so scientists can offer their insights and their knowledge. They can bring together different bodies of knowledge, as is always important and necessary when you do applied sciences in whatever shape. But you cannot say, well, this compromise is a good one or so. You can say it from an ethical point of view or from a consequentialist point of view or so. But you cannot really approve that is a good compromise. In the end, it's a political decision. 6 theses, sciences and politics can destroy trust and can mutually destroy trust very effectively and very quick. So I like the sentence that trust comes on the back of a snail, but it goes with the wind. And politics can, for example, contribute to destroy trust by ignoring evidence and advice without any argument. They can be argument, they can do that, but please, with arguments. Sciences can destroy trust in doing politics, so compromise and so on, or ignoring the evidence of other sciences. And both can contribute to destroy trust very effectively when communicating badly and neglecting multidisciplinarity and saying, well, this science is so important. In the pandemic, it was so obvious, virologists, epidemiologists, but behavioral sociologists, psychologists were not listened to adequately. But you can have all the vaccines. If nobody takes it, well, that's not a success story. So take behavioral scientists, psychologists, communication scientists on board from the beginning, then you can make use of all the vaccines. Let aside the global challenges with allocation mechanisms, price building, so economists should be part of that as well, and so on. So I come to the conclusions. If you are aware, or if we as scientists are aware that you are sitting between all stools when doing policy advice, there are some tools that you can use to manage that. There are only a few, so consider complexity and values from the beginning. Be open for adjustments of your insights of the knowledge body. Just find out which kind of knowledge bodies you all need to do science advice. Integrate different disciplines. Engage in scientific and public discourse. That was mentioned yesterday as well already. So it is not bad to sit in a talk show. Of course, it's not that what scientists strive for. But if you have the opportunity to explain something, to be part of the game, then there's nothing that is bad in sitting in a talk show or giving interviews or doing podcasts and so on. And then keep scientific integrity. I think that is also a claim for scientists among and between each others. If there are divergences, don't play them out in the media. Sit together and talk about it and find a solution to say where the pluralism and where is some possible consensus and where is the way forward. So with having said this, thank you very much for your attention. I'm looking forward for the discussion.
Absolutely fascinating. So I'm just disappointed to learn that you don't strive to sit on talk shows, Christiane.
No.
I love. Yeah. Anyone else strive to? Who strives as a scientist to sit on a talk show? No one dares. But Oh, bless you. You did. You didn't keep it up there for very long, but you did put your hand in. You're like, oh, I don't know. Yeah. It was. I saw it went up, it went down, didn't it? Okay. Here's a question for you. What then, given all of that complexity, let's just look at the science and the scientist side of things. For you, what makes a good scientist? If you have to describe to me in a pub with a glass of wine, Kat, this ideally, in this time, in this era, is I think how I would describe a good, efficient and effective scientist. How would you describe that?
So if I really have to be short, I would say a scientist is a human being that lives his or her life out of the attitude to find the truth for the benefit of this world. Not in terms of data only.
Yeah. And how do you arrive at that truth, given what you've said, that everybody has different values, different considerations, there needs to be a lot of unpacking? How does one arrive at what is empirically truth then? How does that fit in?
The first problem is it's not about empirical truth.
Yeah, I meant it objective. Sorry, you're absolutely right. I shouldn't try and use words like that in this kind of company, should I? Rewind. How does one then arrive at truth?
I spoke about an attitude, an inner attitude. Yeah. So just to say, well, I think there is something like truth out there, or in ourselves, who knows? And I do my way to find it, together with others, because me alone, I cannot find it. But I try to find something that is of value, that has a meaning to this world. And I find out something more, and everyone in this room and online knows that if you find out something, you have more problems than before, yes, because you have more insight in what you all don't know than this one wonderful thing that you found.
Absolutely.
So it's difficult to explain, but it is this attitude, this epistemic humility, this epistemic preliminarity, but being on the way for something that does good for all.
Okay, and let me ask, in the like you said, and that really struck me because I'm slightly obsessed with it. You said pluralism is okay if you stay in the discourse. And I remember some years back I did a moderation with, who was then, I don't know if he still is the mayor of Mechelen, Bart Somers. And I remember saying to him, because he had some quite complex things, he actually got, I don't know if you know this exists, World Mayor Prize in 2016. I don't know why that's doing that. He got World Mayor Prize in 2016. Such a thing exists. And I said to him, you know, when you've got to have difficult conversations with civil society, I will just keep that like this. Don't know why it's doing that. I'm going to remove it in a minute because it's going to irritate everybody. Do you want me to take it off? Okay. I'm just going to... Yeah, I'll take that. So he had very difficult conversations, and with civil society. He has to speak to industry. He has to speak to all different aspects. And so I said to him, when you go into a sort of a town hall setting and you've got to listen to people who are all pushing, how do you do that? And I remember him saying to me, Katrina, I give myself permission before I go in. I tell myself, I give myself permission to come out of there with at least one bit of my opinion shifted, which really fascinated me. So in everything which you talked about so much about the discourse, uncertainty, the value divergence, consider the ethically relevant values of so many different players, do you think that this needs to be taught in schools better than it is, as in a more specific way, the value of discourse? Because it must play into this science policy kind of dynamic.
I'm so grateful for this question, because I would say, yes, it has to begin at the beginning, to broaden the view, to teach children and everyone throughout the lifelong learning, that this world is not about having a very narrow view on it. And it's richer and more diverse and more flourishing if you see different angles, if you see different areas. For the universities, for schools, it would mean don't specialize too early. Mm-hmm. Keep the broad view. For universities, it could mean, and at other academic institutions, it could mean have 1 year or an accompanying kind of a general study, yeah, to have this awareness of these complexities and value loadedness and so on. And I think it's now this.
It's me. I am a cyborg. This doesn't even work either. I'm not even going to try and go on.
I think they put it off because of the, no?
Carry on. Don't
Yes.
let me interrupt. Okay.
And I'm very grateful for the other notion, without changing a little bit. And I think if we really meet the world, if we meet another human being, we experience flourishing when there's kind of a resonance. Yeah, if we grant the other one or the other thing, it can be a picture, a painting that you're looking at, has an own voice in itself. The sociologist Hartmut Rosa wrote a wonderful book about resonance, the sociology of our relations to the world. And he describes in every area, in a lot of areas, that if you really meet someone or something, you get a resonance. It is vivid, it is colorful, it is flourishing, it is warm, it is not cold, dead, hard. And it means that he calls it anverwandeln. So you change and the other thing changes as well in this relationship. And I think this is a wonderful picture of being on the way.
Yeah, absolutely. And much harder when you are face to face with, let's leave the thing aside for a minute, but a person with whom you instantly know from their opinions, that much harder to orchestrate. And that, for me, is unless we solve that, we're going to find it very, very difficult to progress in the era that we are, or the era where, for me, I think for some people, being aggressive is almost a career choice. You know, being angry is almost a career choice. That's my humble opinion. Any one question from the room? I can't see online. Any one question from the room? Just as a kind of a, before I release Christiane and we hear, yes, you have. So, who knows if the microphone works, sir? We will see. Or you can come up. Hey, otherwise we can crowd the stage, but you know, we don't. Is that one working? Just speak into it, lovely person. Hello. God, it really is the caring, sharing economy at the moment. No? Oh, it's only ever the technical side, isn't it? But we love the technicals anyway. No? Okay. There we go, I'll give you that. Voila. Beautifully short, please. Say
Thanks.
who you are.
Hello.
He asked. Okay, it's working.
This isn't working, I take it, no?
Try again, is it here?
This isn't working, no?
Yes.
Okay. Daniel Carey, Royal Irish Academy. My question is really about following the science, which was one of the great phrases of the pandemic. It does give us a rather limited conception of how science actually functions, so I wonder if you would comment on that dilemma.
A dilemma between what? Sorry, I didn't get that. So
Well, the notion that following the science is actually doable in some meaningful way was presented to us politically as an obvious solution to the pandemic problem.
No, following the science was just a misunderstanding of what the political task is and what scientists can do. So listen to scientists, take them into account, and please all those who are involved or have to be involved. But follow the science is not a good concept.
Oh, look, sorry. I throw it back to you then. How would you rephrase, how would you have expressed it if, like a politician, I saw it a lot in the UK, it was the catchphrase. They loved their catchphrases. You can see I'm not a fan of my own government. But if you had to, how would you better have phrased it for a public understanding?
I don't think it's helpful to be afraid of complexity, especially in situations which are demanding. So I think a little bit of honesty about decision-making in the midst of complex circumstances. And effectively, we make probabilistic judgments. Now, maybe that's too sophisticated a phrase, but I think something which communicates uncertainty based on evaluation of data, which does not always point to a single conclusion, is clearly more representative of how people work and think. So something along those lines, I think, might be more
I thought we were getting around the walls there. We are literally invaded by aliens. I thought somebody's tap dancing, not on your grave, just in appreciation, as we say, of your... Hang on, I'm just checking. No, I trust the technical side is working enough to know that nobody online, if you've asked a question, we will get it in a bit. So, unless there's anything else, you will have more time to pose a question to Christiane in a moment. I'm going to release... Oh, there's somebody at the back. Look, I'm squinting into the light. Go for it, sir.
Yes, Robin Grimes, Royal Society. I very much agree with what the last question person said. This idea of uncertainty and getting the public to understand about uncertainty goes back to the comment you made about education. We need to start that process of, sorry, I think I just caused a problem there. We need to get back into the education process and get our school kids to understand about uncertainty, about those probabilities and things really early on. And then also not to present it as a fait accompli to the public, because the public will smell a rat if we do that. So trying to understand uncertainty, understand the processes by which we come to a best solution, I think is crucial part of this.
I agree, and it's also about risk communication. We do a lot of research at the Center for Life Ethics on risk communication for risk for Alzheimer's dementia, for getting dementia in 5 years or so, or to getting breast cancer and so on. And the risk understanding and what people understand, more graphics, more numbers, more comparisons or so, is so important to learn. And first listen, then teach.
Absolutely, and you use the word humility there, and it's my favourite quote from, who is it, Epictetus? We have two of these, and one of those for a very important reason. I think that echoes what you just said. You may kindly take a seat. I'm going to, of course, have you come back. You can give Christiane Woopen a very warm round of applause, please. Terrified of breaking the only functioning microphone in the room that doesn't shriek with horror when anybody speaks into it. Okay, so we of course do have some more presentations now. So just sort of broadening our understanding of this topic and really looking at that relationship between, you know, science and policy making and that dynamic. I'm going to invite to join me now, please, Professor Michael Bang-Petersen. As I said, he is Professor of Political Science at Aarhus University. You can also give him a warm round of applause. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the invitation to come here and speak. So I've been heavily involved in doing research from a social science perspective during the pandemic and on giving policy advice during the pandemic in particular in Denmark. Marion Koopmans said yesterday that the social sciences were unprepared for the pandemic, and I do agree. But I think that it would be more precise to say that what lacked preparation was the interaction between the social sciences and the policy level. The science was there to a certain extent, but what was not established was infrastructures for bringing the right social science into policy making. And that is what I'll be talking about today. So, there's not a crisis in human societies that are not related to behavior. Either the problem is rooted in human behavior, or the solution is rooted in human behavior. Human behavior is the core focus of the social sciences. Accordingly, the social sciences are critical to any crisis that we face as societies. All social sciences converge on one key argument, that trust is essential. Whether we need to stay calm as we do in the case of war preparations, or whether we need to engage in rapid behavior change as we have been doing during the pandemic, then we need to trust authorities, and we need to trust each other in order to do so. A recent estimate in The Lancet suggested that if Scandinavian trust levels had applied globally, then there would have been 40% fewer infections across the world, for example. A key focus of the utilization of social sciences for the policymakers during a crisis should therefore be how can we build trust and how can we maintain trust. This, however, is not how social science is often used. Currently, social science, and especially behavioral science, is often thought of as this sort of bag of small tricks that you can use to shape the behavior of the public in forms of campaigning or in the form of small nudges that you can apply. Instead, I strongly encourage policymakers to use social science as a guide not to how the public should behave, but how they themselves should behave in order to uphold public trust. Because if citizens do not trust policymakers, then there are only one part that can remedy that, and that is indeed the policymakers themselves. So what should social scientists in their interactions with policymakers focus on in order to bring this unmet potential about? I think they should first focus on the mental models that policymakers have of citizens, and they should focus on correcting them. Because there are often quite a few wrong assumptions in the way that policymakers think about the public. Policymakers often fear the public. They fear they won't listen. They fear they won't comply. They fear they will panic. And therefore, policymakers withhold information that they fear that the public cannot deal with, and this is key for decreasing public trust. Nothing breaks trust as much as hidden information. There are multiple examples of this from the pandemic. Trump explicitly playing down the virus out of fear of panic. Authorities across the world withholding information about preparations or telling noble lies to not instill fear. But in general, the public is much better than its reputation. In crisis situations, the public reacts with solidarity rather than panic, especially if they trust each other and the authorities. This is also clear during the pandemic. Enormous behavior change has been driven by empathy for the elderly and the vulnerable. And research clearly documents that acknowledging complexity and uncertainty increases trust rather than the opposite. People can, in fact, handle the truth. The second focus of social scientists in interacting with policymakers should be to focus on their blind spots. That is, focus on what it is that other disciplines do not see. Social science is not just a service discipline, which is often the way it's thought of. Take, for example, vaccinations. Doctors have developed COVID vaccines with incredible speed, and that's fantastic. Now we want people to take the vaccine. Policymakers go to the social scientists and say, well, how can we communicate this in a way so that we can get people to take the vaccine? But there are, in fact, no simple tricks that can do that. The real answer to policymakers is that they should have invested in trustworthy political institutions 10 years ago, and it's very, very difficult to make fundamental changes now. Of course, you can mess things up even more during a crisis, and we have evidence that public trust declined during the pandemic from the research I've been doing. The real contribution of the social science in a crisis situation is in illuminating the complexity of the barriers that hinder people from making the obvious choice, whether that is to get vaccinated, whether it is to engage in more climate-friendly behavior. For example, one of the surprising findings that we had during the pandemic was that those who were not willing to take the vaccine were those who were longing the most for normalcy. One would imagine that fatigue was a motivating factor to get the vaccine, but that's not how the human mind works. If you get fatigued, you become angry, and it's easy to become angry at the authorities and politicians rather than a faceless virus. And when you're angry, you turn down the other advice that they give. During the pandemic, a core focus for me in my advising role has been to highlight the costs of the pandemic, the mental health issues, the felt economic costs, the feeling of freedoms being removed. These are the core topics of the social sciences, and it's critical to understand these barriers in order to motivate people to distance and get vaccinated. Finally, what the social sciences are incredibly good at is mapping what people think and how they behave. Even if we cannot, us social scientists, even if we cannot come up with easy solutions to problems in form of easy nudges, then we can use data, all sorts of data, big data, survey data, ethnography, to identify problems. Does the public support what is happening? What are their concerns? What are the barriers that they feel? Mapping public sentiments is a standard task for the social sciences. What is currently lacking, in my view, is an infrastructure for placing those data at the desks of policymakers. In my research group, we spent enormous energy in the initial phases of the pandemic in establishing contact with politicians and authorities and convincing them that we had something important to offer. Identifying the problems is indeed part of the solution because it invites transparent and authentic communication to explain the strategy and to remedy misunderstandings. Essentially, having clear public evidence on public sentiments gives people a voice and enables policymakers to have some form of conversation with the public, even if it is at a distance. Furthermore, clear data on the public often moderates policymakers in polarized debates. When the data is there, they cannot self-servingly assume what it is that the public wants. And with that, I want to say thank you very much for your attention.
We'll share, because I think, just a second, just a couple of questions before I invite our next speaker. Here's an easy one for you. You can tell it's not going to be. Define trust. Not very nice. It's important. I mean, what does it mean? Does it mean just the policymaker, let's be simplistic now, says they're going to do something, says something's going to happen, and it doesn't, or they don't do it, and that breaks trust? Can that trust be mitigated if they explain why and they remain in the discourse? What is trust? We talk about it, it's huge.
So this is also a big debate in the theoretical literature, obviously, what trust is. So one definition of trust is that it's simply that you know what to expect. And I think that's a too shallow understanding of trust and doesn't really fit our everyday understandings of it. So to me, trust is that you take the other person's welfare into consideration when you are making choices. So essentially that I trust you if I think that you have my interests in focus when making decisions.
And okay, just a couple of questions, and then let me go to another one for a moment. You said at the end, evidence on public sentiments gives people a voice and moderates policymakers. We know that there's a lot of voices in different social media chambers and echo chambers, but where do you collect that evidence that's perhaps less angry, less polarized? How do you collect that evidence? Where?
First of all, I think it's extremely important to get information on those who are not very vocal on social media. And I think one of the major consequences of social media is that they distort the policymakers' view of what is in fact public sentiment. I'm also doing a lot of research on social media, and what we're seeing there is that those who are voicing the grievances there are a very, very small and particular subset of people. So policymakers should make an active decision not to base their understanding of the public on what gets thrown at them on social media. We need to go towards the other tools of the social sciences, which are again, ethnography, studies of what it is that people think in their everyday lives. What we have been doing a lot in the project that I've been leading is massive surveys. We have very, very good methods for establishing representative data on what it is that the public views, what the public thinks, and I think that's crucial to find out what it is that those who are silent also thinks, because the majority is often not very vocal on social media and often have very, very moderate views compared to what we see on social media platforms. And
a last question, if I may. You said social science should or should be used to shape the behaviour of policymakers. The policymakers are shaping some tranches of the public. Again, I'm just referring to I mean, I'm based here, but coming from the UK, and we see that. And then critically with trampling on treaties, telling lies, it's only being outside the EU, we could have done this with the vaccine, etc., etc. Why do people choose to swallow? You said that very interesting comment. Many disciplines are blind to the web of barriers of people making the obvious choice. Why are people choosing to swallow lies, or they don't perceive them as lies, and that's just me being arrogant?
That's a very complicated question. So I think that the reason why people are willing to swallow lies is because it's not so much that they necessarily think of them as lies. It's not necessarily because they think of them as the truth either, but often the kind of misinformation that is being shared is useful to certain segments of the public. And they are useful if we think about Brexit, if we think about Trump, if we think about a lot of populism, then they are useful for people who feel marginalized in current society, who have deep distrust in the current political system. There, the lies and the misinformation that is being circulated is useful because it does indeed feed or resonate with the sentiments of mistrust.
Thank you. I promise that your fellow speakers can ask you the other difficult questions, and the audience. We will take questions. A warm round of applause, please, for you. Thank you so very much. So I'm so bad at this. I'm so terrified of breaking the only functioning microphone in the room. Okay, so let us move swiftly on. Please don't forget, those of you who are with us online, if you're going to put a question in Zoom, it needs to be really short. Those of you in the room, thank you. The first gentleman who asked a question was wonderfully short, so he set the bar very high. Please do jump to that bar. Okay, the third of our fourth speakers is Professor Tina Comes, Professor at Delft University of Technology and Maastricht University. I can ask her to please ascend to the stage. Thank you so very much. You can give her a round of applause too.
I promise not to break it.
Same question to you. What's going to be the thrust? What's the focus?
Complexity and time pressure, and a little bit coming back to what just was discussed in the last questions about decision making. Good. So thanks a lot for the opportunity to talk to all of you. It's a great pleasure. And as was already said in the introduction, my background is in the decision sciences. And that means I research both how people make decisions as well as how they should make their decisions, and then try to bring both together to have a view on how we can provide them with information that helps them to make better decisions. And I do that in the context of resilience, but most often really in the context of crisis, and I have the pleasure to work currently on the evidence review report that will inform the opinion of the GCSA. So, a little bit of background on that, because, of course, through the fantastic keynote and also some of the discussions today, we have still very much in this room a focus on COVID. But, of course, there are many crises that we are currently confronted with. So, of course, obviously, COVID. But we also see the climate crisis. Currently, one of my students is at home in India, in Chennai. They are having this tremendous heat wave. I mean, some people were fanning this morning, but we almost forget about that. And then there is the war in the Ukraine that is currently affecting all of us. And really, through the work for us on the evidence review, but also the work that all these decision makers need to do, we are not looking at one crisis, but we are looking at many intersecting and layered crises. So it becomes harder and harder to solve this. And I'm very happy that Christiane already introduced the notion of wicked problems, because that's what it reminds me of. Actually, and that's also a bow to Antonio, a bit of history here, in the 1960s, in the US, there was, of course, the first man on the moon that we saw, but at the same time, there was a civil rights movement. And then NASA actually started a program that was asking, can we not use all that wonderful engineering? You know, we've managed to bring a man on the moon. Can we not use that to address some of our most urgent and most pressing societal problems? Okay, and then there was a seminar series that was started, and then Horst Rittel was actually working on that program, was a mathematician, to try to figure out how can we use mathematics, science, engineering to address the left side of these problems, and came up then with the notion of wicked problems that Christiane explained, that are so hard to address. Actually, they say that can't be solved only in hindsight. And on the notion of long science, it was actually Melvin Weber who had then to twist it arm to finally write it up and get it published, I think, 5 years later, after these initial talks. But, you know, when you look around a bit today, you can ask yourself, did anything move? That initial paper was published in the 70s, and now, you know, we see Black Lives Matter movement. We see polarization. We see the Gilets jaunes in France. Everywhere in the world, and at the same time we see billionaires flying in space. So has nothing changed? Well, obviously, you know, science has made dramatic and fantastic progress. It was already mentioned, we have new methods, not only in the natural sciences. We have new data, we have new theories. So that all can help us, of course, make at least some progress. But at the same time, we are now confronted not only with wicked problems, but now there's also talk of these super wicked problems. And for me, there are two central tenets in there. Time is running out. If you look at the latest IPCC report, then you know the window we have is continuously shrinking. Now I think somewhere between, sometimes it's still 10 years left, sometimes I hear it's 3 years, but it's not a lot for the climate crisis. We are seeing the sixth big extinction event on the planet. We are witnessing that live. So that's one, and then at the same time, time is running out, and we are focusing on the here and now. In other words, we are discounting our future irrationally. And that has implications, and we see that everywhere. That here, examples from the COVID crisis. That here is from a report from the Global Center on Adaptation. On the one hand saying that is from 2020, we've seen an increasing number of catastrophic climate-related disasters. 50 million people were affected by a record number of floods, droughts, wildfires, and storms. But at the same time, the pandemic is eroding our progress in building climate resilience, leaving countries and communities more vulnerable to future shocks. So because we are focusing on what we perceive as the urgency that is here and now playing, we forget that we are not just confronted with one crisis, but with many intermingled crises. And we discount what happens in other places or what happens in future. And that, even though there are very strong path dependencies in there. Now, one approach to potentially deal with that is adaptive management. I'm not sure if you heard that, but saying, okay, there's a lot of uncertainty and we don't know initially, but you know, there's this process of learning and we have to make an initial decision. So this here is a quote. So a little bit of my research, I slotted in here. We did some field research after Typhoon Haiyan, that's now a long time ago, hit the Philippines. It was a mega disaster in 2013, and that's a quote from a policymaker there confronted with the disaster. So he said, in decision making you have to keep moving. You cannot sit still and reflect too long. It's a bit what Mike Ryan said as well. By taking a decision, you are moving, and then you can adjust and learn. And that's this adaptive management principle. This is how you deal with uncertainty. And then we actually did one of the experiments more on the behavioral side, was on epidemic response. That was before COVID had hit, so we used an Ebola case there. But we wanted to look at, do people actually adjust their decisions when they are confronted with uncertainty. So what we did in that experiment was we gave them biased data sets that they would need to combine to come to the right conclusion. It's called a hidden profile experiment. Then, unfortunately, one of our student assistants that was helping was running around and saying, hey, but groups, did you realize that the data is actually biased, so you should share it? And even though he said that, and we were all very angry at him because, you know, ruined experiment, the groups were not able to debias their data because they were so focused, so there was a time-pressured experiment, they were so focused on solving this challenge. That then led to biased decisions, so that's not surprising. But then, in a second step, we asked them to acquire new information. And even though they knew it was biased, they only looked for, or largely looked for data and information that confirmed their initial decision. And that, I think, is also part of the answer to the discussion that you just had here on stage before, that people are very, very, or invest a lot in confirming their worldviews and their values and beliefs up to the point where it's actually harmful to them. So a very vicious circle, and I was, when we had run that and analyzed the data, I was a bit frustrated and say, okay, so there is uncertainty, there is biased data, but how will we ever get out of this if we are only always confirming our wrong initial decisions? So never waste a good crisis. A couple of examples then from COVID, where I think many of the points have already been made. We need to invest and think about the long-term consequences of our decisions. We need to include all the disciplines that are relevant in this context and frameworks. And then I had the same reaction to the comment of the keynote by Marianne Koopmans that the social sciences were ill-prepared. I don't think that the social sciences were ill-prepared. I do think there was a true lack of infrastructure. There was a lack of networks. But there's also no funding mechanism for preparedness in, like, you know, non-medical, even, I would say. And you know, the European Union had one of their earliest COVID calls that they had issued was for health and social sciences. So we were thinking, great. And we submitted a project there that was on the social sciences. There were 15 projects funded under the call because they said super relevant, mega urgent, we have to increase funding. 15 funded, we had the only social science project that was funded in there. So a part of the solution is also to, I'm not saying you should take it away from the medical research, but you know, acknowledge that these insights are super valuable. How you deal with the infodemic, how you set up good governance structures, how you organize coordination, how you organize logistics. And that's not even pure social science, but you know, think about these questions. And then, you know, I found this when I was starting to think about, okay, what could be a nice final slide? So that's emergency preparedness starts with you, be prepared. Okay, that sounds very logical. And then they have these 3 points: make a plan, build a kit, stay informed. And I think something like that can also be said for science, but also science policy interface. So 1, make a plan, prepare for what will we need to know in case a next crisis is going to hit us. Which scientific advice do we need? What are the infrastructures that we want to take care of, that we want to have in place? Then build a kit. And for the scientists, that is, have the appropriate methods, tools, and toolboxes. I was working before my time in Delft in Karlsruhe, and there we had also like the idea to develop something real-time disaster response on some flooding emergencies. And one of the hydrologists we had in the team said, but my model is only calibrated for the Donau. I cannot possibly do that for you for the Elbe within a couple of weeks. It will take me at least a year if I want to have sufficient quality. So we need to also think about that, as well as the networks and tools we want to have to interface with policymakers as well as with other academics. And that then also goes to the stay informed. The infrastructures that we need to have in place, not just in terms of the data sharing mechanisms and these platforms, but also I think our peer review system is at the point of breaking. I heard in the SAPEA conference that there were 200,000 papers published on COVID in the first 1,500 years. Nobody possibly can read that, and you know, so what is then the meaning of peer-reviewed publications? So we also have to think about that. So my conclusion is that we indeed need to invest in these three elements: preparedness and planning, methods, interfaces, and then the data and information infrastructures to steer better through the next crisis or the ongoing ones.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. I could see Christiane photographing the last slide, actually. Yes, I've got to get that one. Quick question before I hand over to our last speaker. But will we? But will we do that? Given what we know about human nature, given we've had so many opportunities to learn throughout history, do you stay hopeful that we can and will do that? Or will we just wait for the next disaster because we'll put our heads elsewhere and we're a bit lazy and we're a bit challenged and we're a bit exhausted?
I keep it short, I'm absolutely convinced that we can, and I hope that we will, and that's why we do the work we do.
And my last question, just to link it back, and again to the climate crisis, the environmental crisis, looking at this science policy interface that's under the microscope in this first session, if you could say to me, Kat, you know, how would you like that relationship to better function? What we talked about, Christiane said, you know, science mustn't compromise, mustn't enter into that side of politics. Politicians, policymakers shouldn't dismiss science out of hand. If you had to say, you know, we really have to keep it on the agenda for all the reasons you explained, do you have some marvellous idea you could wave a magic wand to improve that dynamic, to keep that crisis at the top of the political agenda and in the minds of people like me and everyone else?
I think that's really a crucial question, and that comes back to the point of understanding the interdependencies between the different crises, and probably has to do with information and alertness to the problem at hand. But we have to realize that that even though our mind wants to focus on the crisis that we see in front of us, there is more than one, and that is a tremendous cognitive effort which requires training and education to say, okay, we are, you know, it's almost, when I discuss with policymakers, it's always like they seem to think we have, or mankind has the right to only deal with one crisis at a time. But that's, of course, not how our world functions. So, you know, you hope you can create that awareness and that urgency, and then also good mechanisms and networks that help to address these problems, because no single person can address climate change or simultaneously climate change, Ukraine, and COVID. It's not possible.
I bet you Trump would say it was possible if he was still in power about himself. Thank you so very much. I will invite you shortly. Thank you. A very warm round of applause. And we are going to talk more about communicating science in general, which was kind of also part of the thrust of the last question that I asked you. So that will be coming in our next panel. So we do have a last speaker. Let me just put this. I'm going to invite Eric Lambin to hop up in a most agile fashion on the stage. He is also a member of the European Commission's group of Chief Scientific Advisors. So I'm going to move now. Let me move that on for you. There's our holding slide. Same question to you. What's going to be the main thrust and focus of this?
Well, I knew that my brilliant colleagues would make all the best points, you know, before I step on the floor. So I will mostly illustrate some of these points with some research examples. And I will, this one, yes. I will make 3 points. I will illustrate the concept of engaged scholarship. I will emphasize again that policymakers need to be better at embracing system thinking. and I will show the importance of partnerships in order to resolve the big social challenges. First, from the viewpoint of scientists, often it's said that the academics are the ones who'd rather be right than useful. And of course, we need to be right. We are looking for the truth. And not all of us needs to be useful in the short term. We need this basic research that will be useful eventually after several decades. But we also need more commitment for research that will have a social impact. And I will argue that this mostly comes from the way we frame the research question. Let me illustrate that by mentioning a project that was really right, but maybe not that useful. And I pick one of my projects because, of course, I don't want to offend any colleague by saying their research was not useful. I mostly work on the policies to control tropical deforestation, and one of the major sustainability issues. If you think that the whole of tropical deforestation every year emits more CO2 to the atmosphere than the entire economy of Europe. So it's a major contribution. And of course, there's a range of policies to eliminate, reduce deforestation, but they need to be evaluated. We evaluated one of them, known as payments for ecosystem services. This is a very simple intervention where we approach forest owners and we tell them, okay, if you commit to conserve your forest, we are going to pay you for that. Because basically you're renouncing for an opportunity to develop some of your land, but also you provide an ecosystem service to the world because you maintain that carbon into your forest. So you deserve a payment, you deserve to be compensated for that externality that you provide. Does it work? Well, many countries do that. But in order to really evaluate with a lot of rigor whether this works, we did a randomized controlled trial. We picked a region in Uganda next to a very big reserve here, one of the last reserves with the chimpanzee population. That's where Jane Goodale worked in her time. We selected 120 villages, and we randomly allocated to treatment and control villages. Treatment, we go to these villages and we meet all farmers and we tell them, well, if you sign this small contract here where you commit not to cut trees, we'll pay you $25 per hectare and per year. If you sign and you still cut trees, you won't be paid, but there's no sanction, no risk for you. Then we have also the control villages. We do nothing, we just observe what's going on, and it's been randomly assigned. Then after a couple of years, we monitor by remote sensing, satellite data, the amount of deforestation in the treatment and control villages. And what we found is that in the treatment villages, the rate of deforestation was decreased by more than 50%. Really massive impact, even though in these villages, only a third of the farmers actually signed the contract. The other one were distrustful of these people coming to pay for land. What do they want, these white people? They didn't sign. So only a third signed, and yet at the scale of the village, we reduced deforestation by 50%, really extreme impact. Published in Science magazine, we have more than 50 media report on this, including the New York Times, the Guardian, hundreds of citations, and yet, I will argue now, research really right, but not that useful. Why not? Well, actually, we continue this research on policies to control deforestation, and now we focus on countries, on a few countries that for a few years managed to really get their deforestation under control. Costa Rica, very clearly, Brazilian Amazon before Bolsonaro, of course, and Colombia for a short period of time also. But then what we find in these countries is not just one policy, not just payments for ecosystem services, up to 80 different policies, a whole policy ecosystem, a whole policy mix with government policies, some private initiatives, some command and control with a threat of sanction, but also some incentives. So a whole portfolio of very diverse and highly complementary policies, and moreover, with a very clear sequence on how these different policies are being introduced in order to control deforestation. And it's really the understanding of this policy mix that's required to be effective. And actually, all of these countries, since one form or the other, had a payment for ecosystem services. But it was more or less successful depending on when it was introduced in that sequence and how it was interacting with these other policies. So a research that's really useful is to understand this policy mix and not just isolate just one of these policies and try to conclude just from one intervention. Of course, now the policymakers are facing this very, very complex world that has been said many times by my colleagues here. You know, if you deal with forests, that's of course related to food security, to indigenous rights, to infrastructure, to climate, and there's no way this challenge can be tackled one piece at a time. Tina just made that point before. There are many interactions, many spillovers between these interventions. Again, let me illustrate that from our research. When we focused on these national scale success stories, we documented what we call the forest transition. So here we have a graph where we have the number of years. We cover almost 1 century here. And here the forest cover, from 100% of the country under forest cover to 0%. If we look at Costa Rica, this was the worst country in terms of deforestation in the 70s, 60s. Really rapid decline in forest cover. But then suddenly you had this right policy mix, and you had this turning point where suddenly they shift from net deforestation to net reforestation. Great success. We found the same in Vietnam, for instance. Again, here, the number of years here, a century, forest cover, we see this decline and then this shift. Highly successful. So again, if you focus on the policy mix, you say, well, these are the policy mix that will turn things around. Yes, but there were spillovers. As we started to look more carefully at what was going on in these countries, we find some very significant spillovers. For example, in Vietnam, they had this complete logging ban. You could not clear any forest. And yet, one day I was reading a newspaper and I saw that Vietnam was a major exporter of furniture in wood, in tropical wood. How can they do that? You know, you cannot cut a tree in Vietnam. Well, if you were standing at the border between Laos and Vietnam or Cambodia and Vietnam, that's what you would see, day and night. You know, these trucks bringing timber from their neighbors. About half of that timber being logged illegally. So basically what Vietnam did, they just exported their deforestation to their neighbor. They were offshoring deforestation. So they solve the problem at home, but then they make it worse elsewhere. A major geographic displacement, a spillover of their policies. Very hard to anticipate because this is the result of private actors making that decision. Just to don't make you too depressed, we computed that and only 40% of the amount of timber that was protected in Vietnam actually was imported from these neighbors. So 60% was real forest conservation, 40% was just displacing deforestation across the border. In Costa Rica, even more complex, very good governance in Costa Rica. The main reason why they had rapid deforestation was due to cattle ranching, something that consumes a lot of land with very little value per hectare. So now they shifted from cattle ranching to very intensive fruit cultivation. Pineapples, bananas, melons, high value per hectare, therefore they could spare land for forest. Now they could get much more value on a small area, and they could abandon all these cattle ranch and just plant trees to regenerate forest there. Great, that works very well. But again, we dig deeper, and then we realize, well, how do you export your pineapples and your melons and your bananas while you load them on ships? How do you do that? Well, you need a lot of wood pallets, right, to transport your fruits. Then we computed what's the volume of wood pallets that you need in order to achieve the trade, and we quantified it, and all this wood is coming from these plantations that were planted in order to restore the forest as a result of the intensification of agriculture. So there was this spillover between agriculture and forestry that was somehow undermining their policies to increase forest cover. My last point, if we look at all these big social issues that have been addressed internationally, we find these big global funds to fight these major diseases, issues of nutrition, carbon funds, crop diversity. All of them, they have something in common. Actually, there's one also on the tropical forest, the Tropical Forest Alliance. All of them have one key common attribute. They are all based on a strong partnership between government, the private sector, and by the way, in the kind of conversation we have on science, science advice, the private sector often is left out, even though it's a key player, and civil society. And civil society, of course, includes academia. And in this trio of interaction, science brings quite a unique contribution. It's the only actor that's fully independent, that's really strives to be fully objective, that informs but does not dictate a solution. It basically expands the scope of choice of options that are available for decision maker without dictating which one should be picked. And also, that's the only one that's really striving to inspire critical thinking in this dialogue. Thank you very much.
I'm going to invite, in the spirit of speed, but I'm going to start with you with a question, all of you to come, because I'm aware, and I will explain how I will do the maths so that you will get to have a break, and we will take some questions. So can I invite you rapidly back, if I may? Okay. All right, so I'm going to focus because we have... In fact, let me just get you installed. I'll calm down and get you all installed. Just to say, just before I do the maths, hang on a minute. We've got one question that's coming online, so I will take that because that's for all of you, and it's about this issue of trust building. I'll take a couple from the room that can be beautifully concise, and I've got a few bits and bobs, and I'll let you choose, given what we said we would talk about. I'll remind you a few points that you might like to make that haven't yet been said, if that's okay. Before I take this question that's come in, so thank you to who sent that in, you said at the end, oh, God, I've come last. Well, I kind of echo what everybody sort of said. Any particular, in no more than 30, 40 seconds, anything that you did pick up and want to reinforce for the benefit of our audiences, given the topic on the table in this first session?
Well, yeah, I'm very struck by the issue of convincing the public, polarization, building trust with the public, recreating the trust in science. I spent part of my year in the United States where the level of polarization is such that any topic, even the most benign topic, right away becomes a political issue. And then the hope of bringing some rationality there is just lost because you are just dealing with highly, highly polarized groups that just try to make an ideological point out of any issue.
Okay, and in the light of that, thank you. That's interesting, again, to articulate it like that, to make an ideological point out of any issue. Indeed, I hope somebody is tweeting, because there's some beautiful quotes that you could be putting out there, and if you're not, I'm very sad. The question that came in for all speakers, let me start with that. How do we speed up the rather slow trust-building process to address the climate crisis in time? So, again, just a thought. I know you can say loads, but just one tip, literally, and then we'll come to another question. Who would like to kick off? Yeah, Michael, thank you. Hopefully that works. It's on, yeah?
Is it on? It is.
Oh, yeah.
All right, so I think what we really need to start with is to not think about this as single issues. There's not one level of trust with regards to COVID and one level of trust with regards to climate. Mm-hmm. What there is groups in society who have fundamental mistrust in the political system as a whole, and that mistrust spills over to everything. So I think we need to get a better understanding of what is the foundation of that mistrust, and I think that the two major areas that we need to invest in as societies is corruption in political institutions and social mobility, because I think those are the underlying structural factors that have caused polarization and mistrust to increase over the last 3 or 4 decades.
Okay. Anybody who wants to add anything different to that? I'm doing a real brain box bingo here for some short answers. Yes, thank you, Tina.
Just very quickly, there's also a lot of, or there has been research on crisis, for instance, amplifying inequalities. That very often is the case. But then if policy is seen to potentially increase that inequality even further, right, then it can lead to more polarization and declining trust. And that's also what we've seen, right? I live and work in the Netherlands. That's a country that is not known for, its riots or so. But in the COVID lockdowns, there were riots because exactly the people that were already, feeling very much not listened to, then said, and now we have to go for another lockdown, and the rich people in their big houses with their big gardens, for them it doesn't matter, but we live here in our small things with... so there is this diversion in society that is amplified, and I think that needs to be addressed.
Okay. May I throw in two further notions, that of honesty and credibility. We talk a lot about transparency, but I think honesty is more. And credibility means for me, for example, and we could possibly follow up on that, that politics has to take into account their accountability to sciences as well. And we don't have a proper mechanism where politics answers to scientific advice. So if there are reports on groups and advising groups and so forth of different kinds, they hand over the report and perhaps they get a talk with a commissioner or someone from the commission or some government or so. But what follows then, who knows? Yeah? So it can be that 4 years after that there will be a law or a command. But there are so many people and scientists who really have other things to do. Yeah, and who want to stay in the laboratory to work on their scientific topics and so on. And they invest their time in this science advice, and they don't get an answer. They don't get a proper answer. Yeah, a thank you letter, great, but it's not enough.
Just a couple
so
of chocolates,
just comment
a bunch of flowers.
on all the advice, comment on why you take up this, this recommendation and not the other recommendation. Just, they can argue that. They can say, well, it's not so feasible on the political level now. I don't think we can get through that. We don't have enough money for that or so. But just say it.
Absolutely.
Just take the advice serious.
But I think you come to an important point in general. Everybody needs some kind of feedback loop or feedback point final, whether it is in the scientific domain, in the academic, those who are advising, but in general, in civil society, in participatory democracy. It's not just having the conversation, it's the reason a decision was taken and trying to accompany people through that. I'm just going to give a steer. For those of you who are online, I know we're a bit late. We started late. And because we have a few minutes to play with here and there, I am going to continue this conversation for another 6 or 7 minutes. So if there's a couple of questions in the room, and I have some specific areas for all of you we haven't touched on so much, I'm going to come back to Eric, if I may, and just focus in on this issue of communicating scientific evidence. Perhaps we can have from you both. What are we missing in terms of communication? We know what doesn't work. We know ways of communicating that proliferate sort of multiplier effect in a way that isn't probably helpful. We can't keep bashing our head against the same brick wall. What insights from the pandemic, perhaps, can we look at to better inform science communication, or just a couple?
First, I think it has been mentioned before, we need to have a deal with a population that has a minimum level of science literacy. Otherwise, every concept of probability and certainty is just not understood. We as scientists have to be much better at improving the clarity of what we can say, especially when we talk to the public, and conciseness also. Of course, we need to communicate the uncertainty, but there's this famous saying that economists always say on one hand this and on the other hand that, and so I think it's Churchill say I want to meet a one-handed economist where it's just one opinion, so we need to be a bit better in that and in getting that clarity. Yes.
I think, Michael, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I think in many ways we are talking, when we talk about the pandemic, we talk a lot about misinformation and stuff like that. But I think in reality, the pandemic has been the triumph of science, and also the triumph of science communication. And I think one crucial aspect of it is that for the first time, the public has been exposed to science as it is, which is a process of constant discovery, constant uncertainty, where we do not sort of easily arrive at the truth. And previously, when the media has reported on science, it has been in these, like, now there's a peer-reviewed article published, and here is the truth on the matter. But we know that that's not how things work. It is really a process where we constantly are confused and in doubt, and I think it's crucial to communicate the procedural or process side of science way more than we have done previously.
And just thus using the word truth in such a stark way, I think just contributes to the lack of trust, because if people go, that's the truth, and somehow it doesn't get delivered upon or followed through, then it's very black and white in that sense. Tina, did you want to come in there?
Yeah. Just very quickly, I think it's also important to understand that one of the purposes of science is to advance knowledge by showing that the existing knowledge is wrong. That's falsification. That's the only thing we can do, and it's great if you show that something is wrong, whereas I think it's the complete opposite for a policymaker. If you show, something that I said or that somebody else in my government said yesterday is totally wrong, and we have evidence that that's awful. But for science, it's how we function, and that's opening the doors.
So, how does it? And I've seen a lovely question come in, which I will put to you from Catriona McCullum. I'd also like to touch upon ethics with you in a moment, but let me just ask that. Here I am, a member of the public, and either you have, as you touched upon, I think you have, scientists and researchers among themselves disagreeing, or perhaps not having that humility, or not having this multidisciplinary sort of ecosystem. Where does it leave me as a public if science has to have that space to continually evolve and change? A policymaker, maybe doesn't think that I can, as we said, sort of accept levels of uncertainty and evolve, but what should I think? Particularly in the instance when I hear scientists disagree. What am I supposed to think as, Mr. and Mrs. Civil Society?
I think there it's really important to not just present the results, but really to present the arguments behind, so that Mr. and Mrs. Civil Society can make an informed decision or form their opinion. That's our job, because we are all also working in university, so we are educators as well. That's often forgotten. We don't just want to produce results. That's nice, but it is about then... and that's also a role, by the way, for the media, not just saying, there's this new paper published and it says masks are good or masks are bad, but really trying to establish argumentation and entering a discourse.
Okay. Let me just, yes, go. And then I'm going to ask you, if you can, stick with the microphone. I do want to perhaps you can just touch on how we do incorporate these careful ethical considerations into this. And also, a little bit I touched on there, whether it's a consensus on societal values, but something of that ilk, perhaps you can also just put your 2 pence in. But go ahead, thank you.
That plays with each other very well, because what I wanted to say is that one task for scientists also is to integrate their knowledge themselves and not throw it out to the public and say, well, you can see, Mr. and Mrs. Civil Society, how you deal with this, or Mr. and Mrs. Politician. If we say this science and this science and this science throws out their knowledge and their insights, and please, guys, try to make a whole picture of that, I think that's not feasible. It's not feasible, and it's not clever and useful. So scientists themselves have to integrate their bodies of knowledge for a specific question and then bring it into the public. And if there's a study and they find a truth and an insight, why not mention at the same time that there are different insights as well? In the media. So there are the discussions parts in the publications, of course, but when you communicate, why not say, well, I found out that, but I am aware that there are other insights out, and I suppose we have to sit together and just discuss it or so. So just open the mind as one individual or one discipline that communicates. And that's the same for ethics. There is not the one ethics. Yeah, there's a whole lot of ethical theories and ethical approaches, and you can wonderfully argue for opposite recommendations from an ethical standpoint. But important is to argue for it, to argue for your position, or even to say, well, that's my position, and there are this and that advantages, but there could be other viewpoints, and they have this advantage, and I now tell you why I prefer the other one. But then it is transparent, then people can make up their own mind, they can find their own viewpoint and position and adjust it to their beliefs. And I think this is the concept, not to say, I am very clear, there's this and one only statement and truth, but to be open from the beginning.
Thank you very much. I'm keeping an eye on time. I'm going to come to you second, so I'm going to take your one question. I'm going to come to Eric, actually, and I'm going to say to Matthijs, if he's listening, don't worry, I know, we will make some adjustments over lunch, okay? Perhaps 5 minutes less on the next panel. I just want to give a little bit of space to honour some audience questions. Eric, let me come to you. What happens, and in fact, I was going to ask this, and we said this was important, and we didn't touch upon this at all. What happens when these scientists involved in advising policymakers are biased themselves towards a particular scientific point of view, and also when they're biased towards a particular, let's just call it a lobby group or a sector or, what happens then and how can this be mitigated against? But let's look at the science side.
Let me answer by explaining the scientific advice mechanism of the European Union, because it really prevents that. One, there's a separation between the evidence review. For instance, Tina, has been the heading that, so that's really collecting the evidence, what does science say, and then the science opinion, the science advice itself, and it's being done by a group of 7 scientists from very different disciplines, very different backgrounds, and we all sign to all opinions, and it's under the control, of course, of the evidence that is being reviewed by SAPER. So I think that's a key mechanism to really separate what belongs to the science, what belongs to the science advice, and what belongs to the policy itself. Yeah. I think this very clear separation with different actors is quite crucial to avoid this subjective bias.
Okay. Any one other comment? Chip in, Michael? Yeah, and then I will come to the lady, and then I will ask you for some conclusions, and I will release those of you at home and those of you in the room for a drink. So, yes.
I think this is extremely crucial, and there is a lot of responsibility for on the individual scientist to make sure that those biases do not enter into the way that evidence is presented, but that they are keeping a very strict focus on what is it actually that we have evidence of. And just a small anecdote, because I think this is also influencing the impact of science into policymaking. I was talking to a politician, and the politician said, well, I actually prefer advice from not independent experts, but dependent experts, in the sense somebody within the system, like expert from authorities, because I know that if they tell me something that's wrong, then I can get them fired, which you cannot with an independent expert. So there is a sense in which policymakers are concerned about the individual biases entering the independent advice that they're getting.
Christiane, did you want to?
You asked me for ethics. Yeah. I'm very much in favor for an ethics by design approach. So bringing ethics and the values in from the beginning of technology development or a research project or so, where ethics and values play a role. Not being the authoritative voice for values, but just to ask the right questions, to raise awareness, to bring in several views and so on. I think that would be a good way to have institutional frameworks for ethics by design approaches.
Yeah, thank you. Let me take a short one, and it might be, if you say it's for the whole panel, I think I'm going to disappoint you, so we might just take it from an answer from one of our panel. Yes.
That's fine, thank you. It's Magdalena Skipper, Nature, and it's the first time I've been referred to as the lady. Thank you for that. So one thing that has not been discussed so far is something that I was really struck by in Christiane's presentation, and it's the fact you said values are baked into everything. We don't talk about values in science, and I think that's a problem. It's a problem because science is considered universal and global, and a lot of values are not. They're very close to culture, and cultures are local. I would like to ask the panel, and I leave it to you, Kat, to decide who responds to that. What does that mean for that interface between science and policy? What does it mean for trust in science? And what does it mean for communication in science? I think that's an important consideration.
Thank you, because it's very specific. I can give you each, I'm hilarious, I know, mathematically, I'm doing my abacus, 30 seconds, and then I will take us into a break, Matthijs, I promise. I also feel I ought to say there isn't just a Mr. and Mrs. I come from the UK where this, I've got to be clear to those of you online and those of you in the room, I use the word Mr. and Mrs. That's the world, so I'm just being clear that, don't wish to offend anybody. There you go. So, Eric, do you want to come back first on this question about values? And
I've been in many meetings that are sensitive in terms of policy advice, and we are just each asked to declare at the start of the meeting what is our own bias. Just to put that on the table and make sure we are at least conscious of that. It's just kind of nudging by declaring publicly to the group, okay, I think this is my bias, then we start the conversation, and everyone does that. I think it's one way to at least bring that to the surface.
Tina.
You get from me a decision-related answer, because so if you try to make a decision or a policy, then normally you would want to say, okay, these are my objectives. And then this is how I weigh these objectives, how I can make trade-offs. And this is where the values come in. So it's not in assessing the consequences of a decision that should not be biased, that should be universal. But then helping with making these trade-offs between the different aspects of a decision, that's where then actually, yeah, indeed, the values come in. And but even there are processes and instruments to support this.
Thank you. Michael.
So I can say what we have been doing in the scientific advisory groups that I've been part of during the pandemic, and what we've been trying to do is to use the values to say, well, what are the important factors to take into consideration? But then we have been very, very explicit in saying, but we as scientists are not able to actually make the trade-offs between those values. That's your job, dear politicians.
Last word to you, please, Christiane.
So sciences are as universal as ethics is. And talking about universal values or universal principles, maxims, and so on, is not contradictory to applying them in a cultural sensitive or area sensitive way. So even if you have a very general level, universal level of human rights or general values or so, they can be applied in very different ways. There can be different value orders, hierarchies. You can have a more collective image of the human being or a more individualistic image of the human being. But that doesn't contradict to claim that ethics is a universal science as well.
Thank you very much. I am going to leave it there. So much that was said, and thank you for giving me the time, Matthijs. I know we started 8 minutes late, but I took 10 minutes over, which I never do as a moderator, but I was so happy to be amongst you, and it was so fascinating, and I think we really did have some huge interest in the room. I think this, for me, came out so much, not least through the two gentlemen who did make a comment, this issue of we need to also help policymakers better understand quite what that public is composed of, and not just assume we're a bunch of headless chickens who can't take uncertainty, who cannot be related to and communicated with in a more adaptive and evolving way. This process of constant uncertainty does not easily arrive at the truth, and I think embedding these kinds of abilities to discuss and debate much earlier in an educational setting could help us with that. So much more to say, I won't say it. I need to release these good people. I'm going to hold you to 11:30, okay, so we'll go to 11:30 for the break. I will help bring everybody back. You're going to have to be quite swift at slurping, and we have got a fantastic next discussion where there won't be presentations. We're going to dive straight in with the discussions then. So I will see you 11:30. For those of you online, it will also be 11:30 Brussels time. Can you please give a fantastically warm round of applause to Eric, to Tina, to Michael, and to Christiane. Thank you very much.